Chanukah, or Hanukkah, is a holiday celebrated by millions of Jewish people all across the world. It's 8 days long, features donuts, potato pancakes, spinning tops, and, of course, candles, 8 of them, lit atop a little candelabra known as a menorah. But the actual story behind this holiday, why it's celebrated, its historical background, and the characters involved are pretty fascinating and surprisingly not as well known. It features the oppression of a people, a violent uprising, and then a lengthy civil war featuring some particularly heroic men and women, culminating in a shocking and miraculous victory which redefined the scape of the Middle East, the future and history of the Jewish people, and created a pretty cool holiday. So, with that said, let's get straight into it. But first, you may need some historical background. This is taking place in around 160 CE and the years before and after. The Jewish people had lived in ancient Judea for a pretty long while. They had just suffered underneath the Babylonian exile, which had begun with the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, and finally the second temple was rebuilt after they all returned, with the Jewish people coming back to Jerusalem several centuries later. So that was around 500 CE. And then, about a century and a half after that, Alexander the Great began conquering his way across the region, eventually reaching Judea. Interestingly, he actually got along pretty well with the Jewish leaders and sages. The Talmud, a fundamentally important Jewish text written a few centuries later, is filled with stories of the rabbinic sages interacting with Alexander, particularly one about Alexander the Great and his great respect he had for Shimon HaTzadik, the high priest of the time, and the meetings and council that they held, which ended in Alexander allowing the Jewish people to keep their religion and autonomy, and as thanks, all Jewish people named their firstborn sons Alexander for the next year, which is why Alexander is passed down as a Jewish name to this day. So, things went pretty well for a while, until eventually, in 323 CE, Alexander the Great died, and his kingdom, which at this point spanned pretty much across the entire known world, was split between his generals. Specifically, Judea fell underneath the area encompassed by the ruling monarch based in Syria of the Seleucid Empire. Now, Alexander's principles of religious autonomy persisted for the next few hundred years, up until the point where Antiochus IV Epiphanes comes around, ascending the throne in 175 CE. He disliked the Jewish culture and practices and decided to impose forced assimilation across his entire Syrian empire of his Hellenistic Greek ideals. At first, it started off pretty casual, displays of their superior artwork, sculpture, sports, clothes, architecture, and general lifestyle, and many were genuinely impressed, to the point where a portion of the Jewish population decided to slowly invest in this new and exciting Hellenistic culture and its more fun, often hedonistic ideals. Many of the more religious class were disgusted by this, and a rift began to form, some of the people deciding to give up their religious practices and heritage to turn towards the Hellenistic ideals, and others maintaining their practices and keeping their Jewish principles. In fact, surprisingly enough, the Syrian Greeks had little issue with the actual ideals taught by the Jewish faith. The code of law is very similar to the other, and things like do not murder, love your neighbor, or keep kosher were things that the Greeks actually not only were okay with, but to a certain extent actually admired. The issue, however, was that while they agreed with all of these ideals as interesting philosophies and secular pursuits, it was only as, and permissible as, an intellectual concept, not a religious one. So, for instance, kosher was fascinating and good as a dietary health system, But that's not what kosher is fundamentally. It's a system that you follow because God said so. It's fundamentally religious, hence the conflict of ideologies. And that's how it progressed, tensions rising over time between the secular Hellenistic Greeks and the religious Jews, until Antiochus decided that enough was enough and issued decrees which entirely outlawed any of these significant Jewish practices and traditions, putting a ban on things like circumcision, Shabbos observance, learning Torah at all, and others. To add insult to injury, he then marched his forces into Jerusalem, seized total control of the capital, and essentially ransacked the temple, erecting a massive idol to Zeus and sacrificing pigs on the altar. This was obviously intended as an insult, and to quash any remaining resistance to the Hellenistic ideals. There's actually a famous story in this regard about a woman named Hannah, who along with her 7 sons, were all brought before Antiochus and one by one ordered to bow down to an idol. Each one refused, and each one was executed before the mother until the last and youngest was offered, even to the point where Antiochus offered him to save face by dropping his ring on the floor and asking the boy to just bend down to pick it up, pretending to bow down to the idol. But the boy still refused, was executed, and the mother took her own life. In addition, these Syrian Greeks marched their forces all across the region, enforcing their decrees with the sword and erecting altars in every town and forcing its members to sacrifice a pig on it at penalty of death if refused. That was until they reached the city of Moidin. The usual charade was enacted. The soldiers marched in, set up the altar, made their announcements, and someone stepped forward to offer the sacrifice, but one person in the crowd had had enough. His name was Matisyahu, and he was a Kohen, a member of the priesthood, along with his 5 sons, Yoin's son, Shimon, Eliezer, Yochanan, and of course Yehuda, or Judah, who watched this occur with disgust and decided to take action. They drew weapons and cut down the entire regiment of Greek guards sent to their city, along with the men who had partaken in the sacrifice, with the rallying cry of, "Whoever is for God, to me." They, particularly the son Yehuda, fled the city and started a band of fighters which rapidly expanded into a full-on rebellion. Their words were, "Whose might is like you, God," in Hebrew, "Mi kamocha ba'elim Hashem," the first letter of each word spelling Maccabee, which in turn means hammer in Hebrew, which ended up being Yehuda's nickname. In time, it would eventually become the name of his dynasty. They traveled town to town, slowly gathering men, a tiny force operating in the mountains and valleys, with little supplies, but for what they were able to take off those that they had killed. But they figured it out, and with the help of guerrilla warfare, tactics of ambushing smaller forces, using terrain to your advantage, cutting off supply lines, that kind of thing, they were able to actually make a pretty sizable dent in the Greek forces. There was one Greek general in particular, a man by the name of Haliphornis, who was giving them a pretty hard time, so one woman named Yehudis, or Judith, allowed herself to be captured by the Greek forces, brought before the general, ate with him, gave him wine until he fell asleep, at which point she drew his sword from his scabbard, sawed off his head, and snuck it out of the camp, bringing it to the Jewish forces, who rallied and destroyed that pocket of Greek occupation. In the meanwhile, the non-fighting younger boys still wanted to hold to tradition and learn Torah, so they would sneak into caves with their books and learn together, and if any Greek scouts found them, they would quickly hide all of their books at risk of execution and take out little spinning tops and pretend that they had snuck out of town to play their little games, and once the Greeks were gone, go back to their learning, which is where the tradition of the dreidel comes from. To commemorate this with a little spinning top, each side of which has letters representing a phrase commemorating the miracle. In the meanwhile, this expanded into basically all-out war. The Maccabees, as the Jewish fighting force were called, had gone from a tiny band of rebels to a sizable armed fighting force, albeit, despite their advancements, a fraction of the size of the Syrian Greek armies. They were a massive, endless tide of armored forces, featuring advanced for that age armor, weaponry, tactics, and, of course, giant armored war elephants. In fact, one of Yehuda's brothers was actually killed in battle by a war elephant. At the Battle of Beth Zachariah, he saw that one was particularly well armored, with royal colors and bearing, so he led a charge towards it on horseback, ramming his spear into the elephant's stomach, killing it and everybody on board, but causing it to collapse on top of him, crushing him. And yet, despite tremendous losses, somehow they miraculously managed, time and time again, to beat back the Greek forces until eventually they forced them all the way back to Jerusalem, defeating the general Nicanor at the Battle of Adasa, and eventually reclaiming the temple. By the way, it's worth a mention, it can kind of be glossed over, but it was genuinely kind of crazy, if only from a historical point of view. I mean, we're talking about literally the most powerful army in the world, a part of a country which spanned across, well, pretty much everywhere, with an estimated 20,000 fighters being used in each battle, each fully armored, weaponized, trained, and using war elephants. The Maccabees had an estimated 3,000 fighters per battle, which is a tiny fraction of that amount. In any other circumstances, this tiny rebellion would have been quashed after maybe a brief attempt at a battle, and things would have moved on, the rebels being quickly forgotten. Here, not only did they resist the Greek forces for decades, not only did they push them back and reclaim large swaths of land, but they actually won entirely and completely, fully regaining their homeland, capital, and autonomy. By this point in time, Matisyahu, the founder of this rebellion, had passed away, and Yehuda was the central leader. So it was with great excitement and fanfare that he and his forces marched back into the temple, albeit slightly disheartened by seeing what state it was left in after all the years of fighting. As mentioned, it had been totally ransacked, artifacts had been aimlessly and carelessly destroyed, a statue of the idol Zeus had been put up. Yeah, it was a bit of a mess. So they cleaned the place up a bit, destroyed the idol, and got to work with the reconsecration and rededication of the temple, which was going well up until the point where they got to a central part of the rededication ceremony, the lighting of the menorah. The menorah was a large 7-pronged candelabra, 6 diagonal branches from a center stem, with the center branch extending a bit higher than the others. By the way, in modern interpretation of images of the temple menorah, they portray it with curved branches. This is false. This is probably based off the later Arch of Titus, unlike the actual recording of its design as penned by Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, a commenter on the Talmud, so don't believe them. It was diagonal branches. This is very important. Anyways, this candelabra, the menorah as it's called, is lit with olive oil. But not just any olive oil, pure olive oil, from the first drops of an olive, which is then sealed in a special jug with the symbol of the high priest. However, in this case, there wasn't a single jug of oil in sight. Literally every single one of them had been destroyed or had their seal broken when the Greek forces had been occupying the temple, so they were unable to light the menorah, and they were just about ready to give up when somebody found one last remaining bottle, a smaller jug, sealed, but with only enough to last for 1 day. So they decided to light it anyways, and yet somehow, miraculously, the small jug of oil burnt for 8 days instead, giving them enough time to run to a nearby city and bring back more oil in time to relight the menorah. Hence, on this holiday of Hanukkah, which literally means dedication, as in the dedication of the temple, you light the menorah, now with 8 branches, 9 including the center, 1 candle more on each night to commemorate the 8 nights with the requisite blessings. along with eating traditional foods fried in specifically oil, again to commemorate the miracle which occurred with oil, like donuts or potato pancakes called latkes and similar. So that's pretty much where things end. Yehuda spent the rest of his life fighting against the Syrian forces until he eventually died in the Battle of Elasa in 161 CE, leaving the Maccabean dynasty after him, which became the royal class of re-established Judea until the time of the Roman Empire. Antiochus himself died, rotting away from some disease, and the Jewish people reclaimed their heritage and tradition and lived in peace and prosperity in that region for like maybe 150 years or so. But in the meanwhile, things were good, and now the holiday of Hanukkah is celebrated for 8 days and nights with lighting of the menorah, spinning a dreidel, eating foods with family, and of course, retelling the story and publicizing the miracle that happened all those years ago. And with that said, that's about it from me for today. I very much hope you enjoyed and learned something new. Thank you so much for watching, and with that said, have a very happy Hanukkah.